Bet the Board presents Stay Green. Stay Green is your first stop for all the metrics, matchups, and money-making opportunities at the track each race week. This is Stay Green, the NASCAR betting podcast. Here are your hosts, Todd Fuhrman and racing analyst Chris Werme.
Welcome into the Stay Green podcast, a NASCAR betting show, part of the Bet the Board podcast network. We have our first race officially in the books. We've had about a week to digest all of it, and Daytona lurking now with the Super Bowl in the rear view mirror. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by professional NASCAR bettor and racing colleague extraordinaire, Chris Werme. And Wormser, the regular season is about to start in earnest. Spoiler alert for our Stay Green listeners. We won't have a big betting card, but that didn't stop us from bringing on a big-time get for our season preview / Daytona projections for the second show of the season.
Yeah. Unfortunately, just super speedways have never been our forte and anything that we really enjoy getting too invested in. So it was nice to, it's nice to actually do a season preview. We're just talking about maybe some driver win totals, some potential value when it comes to a potential playoff run. And I think that one thing that's going to be really important is the changes that have been made to that schedule and understanding what that's going to mean for certain drivers and teams come this fall.
Yeah, especially if they're able to get to the final 4 races of the season, that remains largely unchanged, but just getting there will provide a few more landmines. But since we said it's a season preview, we recorded a phenomenal interview earlier with a prominent racing personality in Danielle Trotta. All race fans know who she is. She jumped on with us last year. Let's get right into it. Without further ado, we introduced her at the top of the show. She was so gracious to join us last year and did a phenomenal job previewing the 2023 season. We figured we would start with her at the top of this NASCAR calendar year as well. You, of course, if you're a race fan, know Danielle Trotta's work all too well. You can follow her on Twitter at Danielle Trotta. You can listen to her. And I think, Danielle, it's MRN, it's NASCAR radio. I can't keep track anymore, from 11 to 1 Eastern, Monday through Friday. But you're better at promoting your own content and all the platforms where people can get your information than Chris and I will ever be in doing so.
Hi, guys. Yeah, SiriusXM is the place to be. Thanks for asking me back. Larry and I have a lot of fun on SiriusXM every single week, 365 days a year. And people are like, what do you... NASCAR, like you talk NASCAR in the off season? Like, we've just been off for 90 days. We just started up again. Yeah, like even the drivers are like, what do you talk about all off season? But there's always news, there's always something to talk about. So we don't take weeks off. There's no off season for us.
You know, it's amazing, Chris. She says they don't take weeks off. She just said they hadn't done a show for 90 days. So I'm not quite sure how to exactly balance.
No, the season.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I give her a hard time with all that. But there is no doubt the NASCAR silly season lends itself to all sorts of opportunities. And we're seeing plenty across the world of motorsports as well, as we sit here and record Daytona week with everything that is going down. But Danielle, real quick, before we get things going, a big watershed moment for NASCAR this offseason. They get Netflix involved. They have a chance to peel back the curtain on a lot of the NASCAR personalities that the casual fan doesn't get exposed to in that kind of all-encompassing full 180 the same way you do, that have been around a lot of these drivers, the crew trees, and everything that goes into putting their blood, sweat, and tears into the race. What was your initial feedback on NASCAR Full Speed and how Netflix did to try and create that similar Drive to Survive that served as a huge catalyst for a North American audience for F1 a few years ago during COVID?
Yeah, I thought after seeing what it did for Formula One, NASCAR was really smart to jump on the bandwagon and give it a try. And it was, I think, by far the most unprecedented, all exclusive, never seen before glimpse into our sport. There's other people that have tried to do, and I'm not trying to take away from any other docuseries that have been done. None have been done nearly at this level.
Look, you can be honest with the USA series. They ran it out at a time that I think was a little bit difficult. They were up against it. And as NASCAR fans, I think all of us, and I'm not going to put words in your mouth or Chris's, I think we were underwhelmed by NASCAR's first light that was shown on it. And for anybody who came away watching that documentary, for our Stay Green listeners, they live and die with the sport. So I imagine they'll see a huge disparity between the way some of those drivers were typecast in that show compared to what Netflix did covering the drama of the playoff race.
Yeah. Well, everything happens for a reason, though. And I think we found ways, and the drivers saw that how they came off on the USA thing. And they were like, yeah, we can do better.
Yeah. Well, I also, the element of binge worthiness, I think, is important. You know, when you have something that comes out every week versus I can just sit down and if I'm interested and you kind of stay, you know, it was hard to follow the USA thing. It was on an awkward times, but the fact you could just episode 1, boom, go to episode 2. I think that we live in that day and age. And so content needs to be presented that way if you're going to keep the audience for the entire season.
Well, and I think, you know, when we look at all of it, you know, it's kind of almost the perfect segue. We have the Clash in the rearview mirror. Credit to NASCAR for moving that race up from Sunday to Saturday to even get it in, given the rains that we dealt with all last week. Denny Hamlin, Danielle, goes out there, wins the race. He was arguably the main attraction for the series. And so for a lot of people that love in this day and age, you say sports are scripted, you get that Cinderella story, for a lack of a better term. Chris has called Denny one of the sport's most important drivers for the platforms that he's been afforded, his willingness to speak out, and doesn't fear some of the retribution. We know one of the big storylines going into this year is Denny's not a spring chicken, is that the one major milestone professionally is he lacks that NASCAR series championship. He comes into the season at a price of 10-1. You look at his over under 2.5 wins, the number there. When we look at the 11 car, knowing that that sand is flowing through the hourglass, to use the visual there, what are some of your expectations for Denny, and kind of speak to what he has meant to the sports for actions detrimental and how we've seen his evolution as a driver over the years?
Yeah. I mean, going back to the Netflix special, like, he's the rock star of the Netflix doc. And it's because every driver was given the ability to show all access, and Denny saw a massive global opportunity to grow his brand, and he seized it. I think better than any other driver. He's so smart. He's in business now with Michael Jordan, owning 23XI. It was so smart to get MJ and Denny's brand out there. Denny lives like a freaking rock star. I mean, his massive house that has a basketball court in it and a bowling alley and his private jet and his shoe collection. Like, he was like, come on. And then, so now, like, everyone on Netflix, like, probably is intrigued by this guy that's won everything but a title. The same week that we have the first race at the Clash, as you mentioned, Saturday night, and he wins it. Like, that buzz is exactly what NASCAR wanted. It is so good for Denny's brand. And now we roll into the Daytona 500, where he's won 3 times, and you throw out the odds, he'll be a favorite again. And now you have all these millions of people watching Netflix that are invested in this guy, going at 43 years old, entering his 19th full-time season. Can he actually do it? And I don't think he has lost anything in his game. And he's coming off shoulder surgery, which he says will only make him feel more physically able to go out there and compete at a high level. I don't know how you poke any holes in his game. And I would say, if he lost something, Father Time is undefeated. I just haven't seen it.
No.
He's so dominant everywhere we go. I think a championship for the next 2, 3, 4 years is still very obtainable.
Well, there's just,
yeah, Chris, you talk about how polarizing he is all the time. So go ahead. I didn't want to cut you off. So go ahead and jump in.
There's just, where would we be shocked if Denny won? Like, at this point, road courses are not off limits. He's obviously worked on that. He's been very public about his effort on road courses. I wouldn't be shocked if he goes out there and competes or wins at a road course. There's just nowhere he can't win. You can look at some other drivers and say, well, they might struggle at this particular track, or they can't win there. Denny just doesn't have that. He's just had some bad luck. You know, speaking of bad luck, we were very high on Austin Dillon as well as someone else when it comes to the Clash. And to kind of have something.
Hey, thankfully for us, our bets got refunded as a best bet because he didn't qualify for the main event. So for any of the listeners that were tuning in to Stay Green for the first time, that's a rare opportunity. You bet an outright, your driver races, and it gets refunded because you don't qualify for the main event. So
what can we take away? Obviously, the racing up front, Ty Gibbs, I think he's going to be a player this year. I think he kind of cemented himself as someone that just is going to be around. I do think he's going to have that learning curve like the Chase Elliott. You know, you're going to have to put yourself in a position more than 1 or 2 times before you go ahead and find yourself in victory lane. We saw the same thing with Kyle Larson. It's going to happen. But what about some of these guys at the bottom that didn't make or didn't have an impressive run in the Clash? Do you think guys like Austin Dillon, who's been phenomenal, and I heard your piece on why you picked him, and I agreed with everything, but like a Chris Buescher, you know, Josh Berry, the short track guy, I know it's the first time in his car. What do we take away from the Clash other than we know Denny and how great that was, but what can we take away for the entire season?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's not a lot relative anywhere else. I was shocked. How do you finish second and third in this race the last 2 years and then not make the field this year? I mean,
it was interesting to see some of those things that we saw now that we've had, plenty of days to kind of process, but it felt like you were at a disadvantage as the track cooled down when you were in some of those later groups, the scuffed tires trying to get heat. But I think to our point, I mean, all of us were in agreement that we thought Austin Dillon was a little bit of a sleeper to try and go out there and win the whole damn thing and have his car perform the way it did versus Kyle Busch, who yet again finishes atop the podium, or in the podium, I should say, mix for the 3rd straight year at the Coliseum.
that's what it has to be. It had to be a cold track and where you came out and what practice group. I mean, it doesn't really, there was no other rhyme or reason to it. There's no logic when 2 of our playoff drivers didn't make it, including one in the championship 4 and Christopher Bell, and our champion Ryan Blaney, who needed a provisional to make it. I don't think that speaks to like the performance of the car, the team, the driver. I think it was like we were scrambling because we were up against weather 5 hours before NASCAR's like, oh, we're racing today instead of Sunday, which has never happened before. If you got a bad draw, like you guys said, I'm taking 0 away from who made it, like relative, really nothing else. I mean, I think it sucks for those guys. Like, it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
Hey, just ask Brad how he felt each of the last couple of years not qualifying for the main, and you saw some of that relief on his face. But to your guys' point, I think Christopher Bell had to be sitting there going, wait a second, I only need 3 guys to qualify inside the top 22, and I'm going to be able to get my ticket in there for a driver that's performed real well at flat tracks. But Danielle, you mentioned Ryan Blaney in the provisional. I mean, Blaney last year kind of comes out of nowhere. We had talked a little bit about him trending in a positive manner, thinking that that phase of the playoffs set up well for him, knowing how well he had performed at super speedways. But I don't think anybody in the betting community believed that Ryan Blaney was going to put it all together, knowing how volatile his performances were. What did you think? Talking to Larry Mack, how surprised were you guys with Ryan Blaney? And if we're looking at drivers going into this season that we think can come out of nowhere, is there anybody that stands out to you in terms of drivers that, bettors and fans should be looking for before we have our first points paying race?
Yeah, I mean, I think Blaney shocked the hell out of me. I think he shocked the hell out of everybody, especially after his teammate and our defending champion, Joey Logano, was bounced in the first round of the playoffs. That's never happened before. So then you have this young kid in Ryan who's won far less than Joey, and he like makes it all the way. And you're like, what is happening? And I don't think that speaks to like all of a sudden he found talent. I think Ryan's always been very talented. I think Penske finally found speed, and Ford gave him something in the final 6 that like Joey just didn't have, 3 months ago when the playoffs started.
It definitely seemed kind of like just that whole Charlotte race when it was like, where did Ryan Blaney come from? And it wasn't like it was a mistake that he won at Charlotte. He went out there and got passed by William Byron on pit road every single time.
I don't want to talk about that race, Worm. I thought William Byron having that first pit stall was going to get me there, and it took all like 3 or 4 laps. There's the 12. There's the 12. Like, just give me a green, white checkered flag, because that was the only chance I was going to have to cash a ticket with William Byron.
Yeah, and then he did the same thing in the playoffs. It was, I think, after Martinsville or even Homestead, it was like, whoa, okay, this 12 has found something. And he went from maybe not making it, to the final 8 or let alone the final 4 to he should be the favorite, and when they unloaded in Phoenix, it was the 24 and the 5 and the 20 were kind of looking at each other like, we are in deep trouble with this 12 car. So I'm kind of curious, do you think that this sport has just become, with the evolution of the playoffs and you kind of got to win at the end, would you rather just have one of those years where you win 6 times like William Byron, or would you rather just kind of get like hot in the playoffs? It almost seems like if you peak too soon, like a Martin Truex Jr., you win the regular season and then you kind of deal with a lot of the late race variants that kind of cost him a chance at a championship. Do you think that the sport is kind of trended towards just get hot at the end and hope you can pull it off?
Well, it's interesting. They kind of go this way on the Netflix doc, and they ask, would you rather be the guy? Denny's chasing 60 wins. Would you be the guy with 60 wins and no titles? And then they go to Blaney and they're like, or would you be the guy with 10 wins, but a cup title? And Denny's like, I'd rather have the 60 wins. And Ryan Blaney's like, I'd rather have the championship. So the way we decide a champion is so different now. And traditionalists will say, well, I'd rather be consistent and known for winning a bunch of races. I think the young kids in this format kind of see if you get hot at the right time, like anything can happen. I think it's a really interesting question. At the end of the day, I would want to be a guy that was considered really good everywhere. I think there's something to be said for, I'm not taking anything away from a championship at all, but Denny Hamlin is regarded as one of the greatest race car drivers to ever live, and certainly one of the greatest NASCAR has ever seen. He's done that by putting 19 seasons together of just an incredible bar of excellence. And like you said earlier, Chris, just winning it anywhere and anywhere. So I think they really feel like there's something to be said for that. But yes, I think that they all understand now that we've been a couple years into this new format. It's really important to win at the right time and winning late in the.
Listening to you guys kind of break all of it down, I think it's so interesting because clearly with the new media rights deal and everything else that NASCAR has going on, we're never going back. We're going to get the most consistent driver because you lose some of that drama, especially over the last couple races. You get the elimination type setup. And Danielle, Chris and I have talked about this all the time. What stinks for some of these drivers is you look at the number of tracks that you have as available options for a championship race. It's not like you can go everywhere in the sport in the month of November. So whether it's a rotating basis between Phoenix and Homestead, maybe you get Vegas in there as the final race. There's so many things politically as much as geographically and a weather standpoint that if you can't get good at some of these tracks, it doesn't matter how good you are everywhere else. You better make sure that you're putting a ton of emphasis and effort into making sure that you can forge that mastery at the flat oval so you can put yourself in a position, should you be in an elimination race in Martinsville, and then roll that forward into Phoenix, knowing that you're going to have a chance to win, especially with the uncertainty that we're going to see inserted into the first round of the playoffs this year, with the road course and a lot more other variables there. So it's awfully interesting. And, circling back to the Netflix, I have to imagine those producers were thrilled that Blaney happened to have a very charismatic and photogenic significant other that they could focus on as well to really help sell the NASCAR image in that similar model to what we saw with the F1 series and some of the young 20 somethings that all look like they're cut from a piece of marble and can go right on the cover of GQ. So
his fiance Gianna definitely, I would say, lit the camera up anytime she was, and you just couldn't stop staring at her. I mean, she's a pageant girl. She's a model. She's absolutely stunning. Ryan is like your cool, hip, like tatted up, young version of a, modern day pro athlete. He's fast. He's got the hot girl. Like he's a champion that we should certainly celebrate. And I honestly wish that, our champions were more widely known across the country, like whoever wins the Super Bowl and some of and Steph Curry, because we have such an opportunity because Blaney's so likable. He's so relatable. He's just really cool. I think he is. So, I mean, I think the Netflix special is like definitely good timing for him because he probably has millions of people realizing that he's a NASCAR champion that probably would have never known otherwise.
I mean, they really should have delved into Blaney's affinity for Star Wars as well. You could have converted another faction of the fan base that may not necessarily overlap in a Venn diagram when I have Star Wars on one side and I have the gearheads on the other going, wait a second, we have NASCAR drivers that love Star Wars as much as us. We need to get involved. And we mentioned Ryan Blaney and some of the pieces he brings, a very worthy champion, winning races when it mattered most. But NASCAR's most popular driver last year, Danielle, never seemed to be able to get things going in Chase Elliott. And when we look at sport from a charismatic standpoint, Chase has grown up around the sport, a little bit more buttoned up than an outspoken Denny Hamlin and even Ryan Blaney to some extent. We see his over under, and Chris, I'll get your take on this in a minute, for his win total set at 1.5, but still gets a ton of respect from odds makers, priced at 7-1, significantly shorter number to win the championship and get his second compared to a Denny Hamlin at 10. How should we be approaching the 9 car this year, Danielle? With Chase, essentially, we're hoping getting a full 36 races under his belt, but you can also look at it and go, is he the third best driver on his own team behind Kyle Larson, William Byron? And, Alex Bowman should be healthier. I still think Chase is clearly a little bit more decorated than Bowman, but Chase the third best, at least right now, on a week in, week out standpoint in terms of win equity in the betting market.
I think upset Chase Elliott Nation a lot and made waves last season, just saying something is not right with Chase. He's off, and I don't know what it is, but he's not the same Chase that we know. I have no idea what to expect from him if he can't psychologically. I think it's all here. And if Chase can forget 2023 and refocus, I think we can see a Chase Elliott that we've seen the last several years. Last year with the snowboarding injury and the suspension for rough driving, he missed 7 races. He didn't win. I think that took him psychologically into a very dark place. And I am interested to see if Chase Elliott has done the work to come back mentally tougher and stronger and just kind of shed everything that happened and is healthy. He had a broken leg. Is he feeling 100%? Is he psychologically back into a good place? Because we know he has the crew chief. We know he has the car. We know he has the equipment. We know he's on the winningest team. He drives for the New York Yankees of NASCAR. He has no reason to be the third best. He has everything in front of him. When Kyle Larson came in, it took some wind out of his sails. Then Byron came on strong. I think it knocked some wind out of his sails. I think he was shaken and stirred last year. Can he put all of that behind him and mentally refocus? That's, to me, the question. And he was out so early in the clash with some suspension issues that I never really got to see much of what he had. So I'm as interested as everybody else to see if the old Chase bounces back.
Chris, we saw him gain some momentum last year, had better finishes that kind of came in under the radar when he was racing for ownership points late in the year. But because he wasn't one of the playoff drivers, I don't think he got nearly as much run on any of the NBC telecasts. When you look at the way he's being priced in some of the season-long markets, do you feel odds makers have gone too far? Or are we still seeing the Chase tax applied from a big picture standpoint that we've talked about at great lengths on these very shows from a week in, week out standpoint?
Well, clearly at a 7-1 price to win the Cup, they still think that the consistency is there. I think that that's more pricing of just Hendrick Motorsports, not necessarily Chase individually, because he shouldn't be one of the favorites, in my opinion. There wasn't one point last year at any race where I thought, whoa, Chase Elliott has the best car. We've seen that in the past of the 9, going back to even his championship run at Phoenix. There was no question who the fastest car was. He's like, yeah, I'll start in back. That's fine. I'll be leading by lap 80 or whatever it was. We just haven't seen that. But I do think there's a little value on over 1.5 wins. He still drives for Hendrick Motorsports. And I do not think that Mr. H is going to sit back and let the 5 team and the 24 team just run through the rest of the NASCAR field and not have, Chase Elliott be a part of that conversation. I don't think that's going to happen. New spotter this year. So there is, I think, that mental aspect, a new voice in your ear, to kind of steelman what Danielle's talking about. Is it was hard for him. And he just kind of puts on this face like, oh, I'm going to go out there and race. And he's great to fans. But I guarantee that there was some stuff going on behind the scenes where he's having maybe some conversations with his dad, like, man, this is hard. And whenever you go through something like that one season, it won't take much to kind of flip that momentum. If he goes out there and has a great run in Daytona, or even just kind of puts it on the pole or wins a duel, gives him that confidence, then we'll see what happens at Las Vegas. And Las Vegas will kind of see what these new noses, how the Hendricks noses will compare to these new Ford and Toyota noses. So I do not like him to win the championship at 7-1, but I do like his over 1.5 wins. I think that he will show up with speed. There'll be times, maybe 3 or 4 times this year, we'll be like, well, he's the car to beat. And he's a guy that can win anywhere. So
We may have to send some of these regular season win totals to Larry Mack and Danielle, have them break him down, because Larry Mack is the king of being optimistic, and we sees all these high profile drivers have win totals set at 1.5. He may clamor for all of them to go over and end up netting out with giving out 50 checkered flags before the betting market with math that definitely won't pencil there. But we mentioned Chase on one end of the spectrum, and Danielle, a driver that the NASCAR community has known about for a long time, perform well at the Chase. We saw him start to get his feet under him. You talk about being born into a NASCAR family. Ty Gibbs checks every box in that particular regard. We see his price to win the championship right around 20-1. The expectations from odds makers is that he wins one race this year. You do have to lay a price to go over. Starting to build a little bit of a rivalry with a two-time champion in Joey Logano that you love to see. But when you look at Ty Gibbs racing for one of the elite teams in Joe Gibbs Racing, who's probably 1A or 1B, I should say, to Hendricks in terms of 1A and what they've accomplished in the sport, how do you go about assessing what should be realistic expectations for the 54 and one of NASCAR's rising stars?
Yeah, he certainly is. And I think when you asked earlier, who's like a guy, like maybe a Blaney that we should keep our eye on for 2024, Ty was the first name that came to mind. And I even forget, because you cover the sport every single day, like Netflix goes back to, they start with the regular season finale at Daytona, like who's going to make the final spot in the playoffs. It was down to Ty Gibbs.
Yeah.
And Bubba Wallace, and how quickly we forget that, he was one wreck shy of being a playoff driver as a rookie. Like if that doesn't, and in the best equipment, as you said, at Joe Gibbs, and oh, by the way, the grandson of Pro Football Hall of Famer, NASCAR Hall of Famer, Joe Gibbs. So he's going to have the best ride for his entire life. I mean, we'll be talking about Ty Gibbs for the next 20 years. I mean, I think this is like our next star, and he's just like brash and cocky.
Yeah.
That like, he doesn't really give a bleep. He really doesn't. Like Joey Logano got in his face Saturday night and Ty like laughed at him. I mean, that's a two-time champion with his finger in your face saying like, don't race me that way anymore or else. And Ty was like, cool, see you at Daytona.
Yeah. Yeah, good try.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to have that backing of your grandfather, knowing that you're not going to lose potential sponsors. So you can stand on that to a certain extent compared to some of the other drivers that are out there. But, I think, for me, we saw him at the Xfinity Series and everything else. And what really opens your eyes, unfortunately, is the way he handled the Brandon Jones situation and trying to drive his teammate off the track there. But you know what? Ty Gibbs has a little bit of that fire in him. And you saw some of it from his teammate in Denny Hamlin, who says, my job as a team owner is to get Bubba Wallace in, that if push comes to shove in the final couple laps. So you can see some of that. And you have to imagine the Ty that's been around the sport, dealt with his fair share of tragedy with some of the family situations and everything else, has been toughened on the outside, that he's not going to take shit from anybody out there on the track. So it'll be interesting to see how many enemies he makes, and at the same time, how many races he gives himself an opportunity to try and win. I know we don't have. Oh, go ahead, Danielle.
By the way, he almost won Saturday night.
Yep. He had the best car.
Yeah.
He had the best car when he got out there, and, really should have had an opportunity to win and build some of that momentum in a non-paying points paying race.
Yeah.
Yeah. The crazy thing about Ty this year for me, I think it's either no wins or 3 wins, and like it's competing for a championship. It's so hard to win these races. I don't think that you're going to be able to just kind of luck your way into some of these. Maybe if you look at these super speedway races, but they're not giving these things away. But if there's speed in that race car and he makes it into the playoffs, he is a great road course racer. He was really good at Watkins Glen. That's now in the playoffs. He can get better at the Roval. And who knows what can happen? You got 2 super speedway races. Not only do I think Ty Gibbs could win 3 races, if there's speed in the car, he can be there maybe into the final 8, and we could be talking about him potentially at Phoenix. Now, it's a double-edged sword, because I do think that there's a chance he does not win a race this year.
Yep.
It's still hard to win these things, as we saw the other night. Arguably the best car he's going to have all year. You don't get out to a 2.5, 3-second lead at the Clash unless you have a real fast car. So, that's like a 7 or 8-second lead on a 1.5 mile track. So if you don't win with that best car the first time, it's going to happen a few more times for you to, kind of figure out what needs to happen in late race restarts in order to get a win.
And I mean, Chris, we've talked about this before. The worst case scenario for us as bettors is that Ty Gibbs doesn't win races early in the season, but consistently has top 5, top 7 speed, that you're going to see his prices that were 30, 40 to 1 at 1.5 mile tracks, open at 20, get down to 18, get down to 12. And by the time he's able to grab a checkered flag and get into victory lane, there won't be any
He's like
win
6
equity
to
in it
1.
for
He's
all
the
of us.
favorite.
Yeah, that'll make things
Yeah,
tough.
we don't get paid.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Danielle, we could talk to you for hours about all this stuff, but we know your time is extremely valuable in the preseason covering all these races. So one final question for you, and I think we asked you at the end of last year's show, and it's always great to get insiders' perspective. Danielle Trotta becomes NASCAR commissioner for a day, whether it's on track from a competitive standpoint, the schedule, the distances, media capabilities. What's the one thing that you would like to see the sport change to try and make it better, whether it's more welcoming, anything that you can do for NASCAR? You have the magic wand to change one thing about the sport. What are you doing?
It's a good question. This is my 15th consecutive season. I've never been this optimistic, and I really mean that. With the Clash in LA, I think they were trying to do all the right things with the Chicago Street Course. I feel like that's super cool. I think they're doing all the right things. Continue to put drivers in position to showcase their personality, and let's sell them as like the heroes that they are. Um, I would say the one thing that I would have done, and we kind of touched on this earlier. I think you had such a golden goose, and Ryan Blaney is our champion. It was like a couple years ago, someone said, ask Kyle Larson after he won the title, like, how did your life change after you won the championship? And he's like, it didn't. Like, no, no one didn't know me before knows me now. That's a perception problem. Like when you have Tom Brady on a boat throwing, the Super Bowl trophy across the boat to like have.
By the way, Chris, it always comes back to Tom Brady with Danielle. In case you haven't realized, it always comes back to Tom Brady in some capacity for Danielle.
My boy. Everyone knows Tom. Everyone knows Gronk. Everyone knows Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes. We've got to do more as a sport to make these guys and make our champion a household name. I think we're kind of doing the rinse and repeat, stops on the championship tour. Like they'll do the late night shows and they'll go to NASDAQ and, they'll stop by Barstool. Like we've done that. Netflix again is a great step in the right direction. So I like where we're trending, but we've got to do more to make these guys the mainstream stars that I think they should be.
Especially from the champion, because I feel like the Daytona 500 champion gets more notoriety than even the champion for the sport. I mean, it's a media tour. Once you win the Daytona 500, you're like on the Tonight Show, and then you win the whole championship for the season, and it's like, yeah, you're gonna go to Barstool and do an interview, and it's like, oh, okay. Anything else we're gonna do for that? So,
it's wild though. And I think NASCAR unfortunately becomes a prisoner of its sporting calendar. I mean, you look at Daytona, football's over. Daytona gets center stage. And by the time we're crowning a champion in early November, most of the major news outlets are fully entrenched in college football. For NBC and Fox, they're entrenched for the NFL and their investment in those platforms. So it's always being caught between a rock and a hard place in terms of what the sport has to try and bridge, the calendar it's dealt with. But to your point, Danielle, I think the NHL has a very similar problem when it comes to marketing their superstars as well, because a lot of their guys, they're soft-spoken. They come from, quiet Canadian provinces where a lot of NASCAR drivers aren't around the glitz and glamour. They're not born in the New Yorks, the Bostons, Chicagos, and Miamis where they grow those brash personalities. So it's great to see Denny do that and kind of lead the charge. And you hope he can set an example for that next generation of potential champions and make some of these NASCAR drivers those household names like they were back in the glory days of the sport when they were doing massive TV numbers with the Dale Earnhardt seniors and a lot of the other high profile personalities. So Danielle, can't thank you enough for your time jumping on for the season preview show. It's a great way to kick things off. Maybe we'll have to get you on again for another show during the course of the regular season. You guys can, of course, follow Danielle on Twitter. That's at Danielle Trotta on Twitter. And you can listen to her Monday through Friday on NASCAR XM Sirius Radio alongside our good friend Larry McReynolds as well from 11 a.m. to 1 Eastern. And like Danielle says, even when NASCAR has an off season, her and Larry Mack do not. There is plenty to talk about. Danielle, enjoy the season. I can't wait to see the seasoning opening race this coming weekend at Daytona.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate you so much and having me back. And I'm not saying it because I'm on, but honestly, I talk NASCAR all day, every day with a ton of people. I am thoroughly impressed by y'all's level of knowledge. Like, it is superior to 99% of the other stick and ball voices that do what you guys do. So trust Todd, trust Chris, because close to as an expert that you're probably ever going to get.
Hey, one last thing on that, Chris. You know, when Danielle says that and gives us the stamp of approval and a ringing endorsement, it's also a small pat on her back as well. Because she was my coach when I came into NASCAR media for the first time as well. And I'll never forget, Danielle goes, it doesn't matter. Just fake it till you make it. And eventually people will start to believe what you say. And here we are nearly a decade later talking about the sport and seeing more and more gambling discussion. And it's great because we've had trailblazers like you, Danielle, and a lot of the folks that you've worked with along the way. So we'll always be indebted for the NASCAR wisdom you imparted and can only hope to try and take some of those things further. So happy travels for the upcoming season. And we can't wait to get you back on the show a little bit later in the year.
You guys call, I'll be there. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great stuff, as always, with Trotta, Werme, and you love to hear her perspective. I mean, she wants these NASCAR drivers to be absolute rock stars, and who can blame her? I mean, you need some of that personality if this sport is going to try and grow its popularity. I mean, you and I talk about it all the time. It's not going to compete with college football and the NFL for viewership eyes, and it's a problem they run into with some of the biggest races during the playoffs. But when we get into the spring, we get into the summer, it's NASCAR and baseball that are going head to head. If some of these drivers become household names, people are going to tune in and watch the Poconos. They're going to watch the Michigans and some of the other races other than just Daytona 500 that Fox does a tremendous job trying to push a PR campaign around, knowing that football viewers are looking for something to do the following Sunday.
Yeah, I think we did discuss. I just think it's crazy that the first race of the year, they call it like the Super Bowl. So I think if you're just a common fan and you're going, wait, the Super Bowl, so if I just watch this, I don't need to watch the rest of the season.
It's a great point. It's a marketing genius that sometimes goes a step too far, in my opinion.
Yeah. And the other thing too is, the conversations last year that were had with, I can't remember if it was William Byron, where Jeff Gordon had mentioned, or mentioned something about Denny's podcast and not drawing a lot of, I would just say, publicity, good or bad, and how that's not part of Hendrick Motorsports' way. I completely understand that, but no one's talking about Hendrick drivers like they're talking about Denny Hamlin.
Nope.
And Denny understands this game. He's winning, by the way, in my opinion. And I've always said he's the most important, well, not always, but recently the most important driver owning a team. He's getting to realize that this personality, people seeing that, is going to attract fans. It also is going to attract haters. But as long as people are talking about it, you stay relevant, you're going to make more money, you're going to be in the news. And that way, when he does win or he does get that championship, or he finds himself in the Final Four, not only is he going to cash in financially, but I think he'll go down as one of the greats of all time, maybe in the top 3 or top 5 drivers in our sport when it comes to talent and influence.
That's why it's also great getting Danielle's perspective. I mean, she's around the NASCAR community in Charlotte, fully entrenched in it. And to hear the positive things she says about Denny Hamlin and what he means in terms of the great drivers of all time in the sport, knowing that he's still missing that elusive championship. We'll see if this is the year he can win it. But we talked about a number of different drivers with her. We know from a season-long standpoint that the schedule may not exactly provide some of the same betting opportunities, at least early, for us to try and get involved. So there are still some other drivers that I think are worth touching on that we couldn't get to with her. And we, of course, talked about Denny Hamlin. We went through some of the other Toyota drivers that are out there. When you look at some of the others, Martin Truex Jr., 12-1, Christopher Bell, 12-1, Tyler Reddick, 16, and Bubba Wallace at 40. But you look at the win totals and the way that odds makers have them forecasted, these numbers courtesy of Westgate, Martin Truex Jr., over under 1.5 wins, lay $1.40 to go over. Christopher Bell, over under 1.5 wins, lay $1.30 to go over. Tyler Reddick, over under 1.5, shaded to under at minus $1.60, which I think will surprise a lot of people. And Bubba Wallace, essentially a coin flip, a pick 'em to just win one race. These markets illustrate how difficult it is to go out there and win one of these 36 cup points paying races. When you look at those Toyota drivers, what's kind of your initial takeaway for the way they're being priced?
Well, I think the first two you notice, I think, are Reddick and Wallace. Reddick did not have the same kind of year on road courses last year. If this were to be the number last year, I think a lot of people would say, "Oh, you have to pound Tyler Reddick. He's probably going to win 2 out of 4 of these road course races." And that doesn't even include his ability to go win on ovals and potentially a super speedway. I also look at Bubba Wallace at 40-1. He's in a fast car. If he can ever figure it out kind of between the ears, I think Bubba Wallace could be a force to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, right now, I just think he's his own worst enemy. He has this constant chip on his shoulder, which I understand. I can't imagine what it was like for him growing up, getting into NASCAR. But he's the only one saying it. Everyone else is saying, no, Bubba Wallace can go out there. And I don't know that he can win on road courses, but he can win on short tracks. And I think he can win on 1.5 mile tracks. And he's proven that he can win on super speedways. So I think that from a value perspective, Tyler Reddick and Bubba Wallace, those are, I wouldn't mind either one of those guys for a championship run. Where we do have to put this disclaimer is, as a whole, I don't love just the championship playoff format with the races. There's just going to be more luck involved in these first couple rounds. And whenever that happens, you might find someone that's not running as fast that might make the final 8. And I think that they don't have any chance. They may have lucked their way in there and not be and take a spot of a guy that could potentially win. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is we could see anybody can go out there and win. Not anybody, but certain drivers can win at Watkins Glen. Certain drivers can win at the Charlotte Road Course that might not have a chance at Phoenix, Martinsville, or Homestead. And one of them would be Michael McDowell, but he's going to get 2 chances on road courses to win. Just becomes way harder to handicap. Throw in Atlanta in there, and your guess is as good as mine. But I do think from a value perspective, I like that Reddick and Wallace. I think that Bell and Truex probably properly priced, in my opinion.
Well, here's the thing that I find fascinating. And of course, this wasn't true at every book. I went through and charted how some of those odds to win the championship moved throughout the course of last season and to a lesser extent the year before, the first time we got it in the next gen car. The only driver in 2022 whose odds didn't drift further at some point during the season than they were to start the campaign to win it all was Ross Chastain, because when he won at COTA, that number got cut and he never became a 40-1 shot to win the championship. And last year, the only driver's number who never really drifted far beyond the price that we locked in early in the year would have been Kyle Larson. I mean, everybody else, even if you like Denny Hamlin, you had better prices available going into the penultimate race of the season at Martinsville because of where he was on the outside looking in. Even Martin Truex Jr., after being the regular season champion, his number continued to drift, and the list goes on and on. So when we talk about trying to secure a little bit of that win equity, NASCAR, because of the format that Danielle highlighted, talking about the uncertainty in the playoffs and drivers getting hot at the right time, that books are forced to read and react. It's not like betting those stick and ball sports where you may get a team at 200-1 and that number will never present itself because if they get into the playoffs, their odds aren't going to drift. NASCAR, look, you may get better prices with 3 races to go in the season for a driver that you think has a legitimate shot to win the championship. And it's a lesson that we learned, having thought that Kyle Busch at 18-1 was going to be the best price all season. Kyle struggles in the playoffs, and our listeners let us hear about it because I could get 30-1 on Kyle Busch.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have had the tickets sitting in my account for 6 months. So it's something to think about when you look at the big picture markets. We know everyone likes to cash a future, but our job here, kind of leading people in their first foray through NASCAR, or kind of being a Sherpa through the motorsports spectrum, is to make sure that they're getting their money in good and keeping some of that dry powder on the sidelines with some of these bigger prices to win the whole thing, regular season win totals notwithstanding, because those will all come off the board after Daytona. Although who knows, maybe some books will continue to update them at least through the first 8 to 10 races of the season.
Yeah. Just looking at Atlanta, if you get a DNF in Atlanta, you're probably going to get a better price on that driver after his DNF at Atlanta than you would at this point in the season. Now, there's a few maybe exceptions to the rule. It also depends. If someone goes out there and wins 6 regular season races, okay, that person might be, if you pick that person out now, well, congratulations. But, you're looking at potentially getting a better price that first round after the first race. So I'm just treading lightly on futures after my very confident Kyle Busch run. It was nice to see him win at Fontana. The crazy thing is we've now seen Kyle Busch 1 season in, he wins 2 races, and now his price is still 1.5, but you're getting plus 150 on the over.
Yep.
And he's still 18-1 again. So, and I'm not confident in that at all. I don't like that bet. Whereas last year I thought that the 8 car was going to be a little bit faster. Who knows? I'm sure he'll go out there and dominate this year. And my ticket from last year, I'll try and cash that, see if it still works.
Year 2 with RCR, so we'll keep tabs there. But, we may as well stay in the Chevrolet camp. We mentioned Chase Elliott, what his prices look like. Kyle Larson, 6-1, the most talented driver in the sport. I think you and I would agree. You can put him in just about anything. 1 wheel, 2 wheels, 17 wheels. Larson's going to drive the hell out of those things. And sometimes that aggression works against him. He has one of the biggest regular season win totals it's posted, 3.5 flat at Westgate. His teammate William Byron, 7-1 to win the season-long championship. His win total sits at 2.5 to 1. And here's little old Ross Chastain, who when we go back and use the Netflix show as a point of reference, his house looks a little bit different than the estate that Denny Hamlin has built for himself. And you can appreciate the humble roots and nature of Ross Chastain, 20-1 to win the championship. But interestingly enough, his odds to win a race, over under a half, you do have to lay $1.80 to go over. Do we think Trackhouse can get back and regain some of that consistency? Because Ross found speed. I mean, he won 2 races last year. He won at Gateway or Nashville, I can't remember. And then, of course,
Nashville.
Everyone forgets he wins at Phoenix, and he did everything he could to make sure he kept Ryan Blaney sitting behind him instead of getting to the lead.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is we just talked about this with Danielle, is you have to be able to win at Phoenix. Ross Chastain proved he can do it. Not only can he do it, but he did it for the first time, a driver outside of the championship 4. So that's how good that car was. It looked good in practice. It looked good in qualifying, and he was able to get it done. So absolutely, I like Ross Chastain. I think that he's a gritty driver. He kind of disappeared a little bit last year with some comments after Rick Hendrick went public, making some comments. But I think that the gloves are going to be off, and Chastain's going to go out there and race. I'm not going to lay the -180, but I do think that Ross Chastain wins a race. From a Ross standpoint, it's just a matter of, can you win by rubbing people the wrong way? Do you need someone to let you go late in a race, or, maybe it's at Martinsville, trying to get to the Final Four. And at this point, there's just not many people that are hopping on Chastain's side and saying, yeah, this guy's raced me clean all year. I'm going to let him go because that's what he needs. You're just going to get guys to just race you hard. And Rick Hendrick said, I don't know that you can win a championship doing that.
Oh, and it's a great point. Although Chastain, we did see him scale back some of the aggression. And I think on some level, it almost took away that competitive advantage that he had earned. So it's trying to find that decent medium that's there. You hope that everybody that had an axe to grind with Ross Chastain last year got it out of the way. But given what we saw about a week ago at the Clash, that may not be the case, as Ross decides he wants to make new rivals trackside as well. One other area before we get into a very brief synopsis of Daytona, we have some new faces in new places. And Noah Gragson goes from Legacy Motorsports to the 10, replacing Eric Almirola at Stewart-Haas Racing. Josh Berry takes over for iconic NASCAR driver Kevin Harvick in the 4. Daniel Hemrick to the 31 for Cowlick Racing. We, of course, didn't get a chance to see what he's capable of doing yet. And John Hunter Nemechek to the 42. I don't see any of these drivers, Werme, factoring into season-long things, but suddenly Stewart-Haas Racing goes from being one of the more veteran teams at the track to, I'm real curious what we're going to get on a week in, week out standpoint, because there were weeks last year that if it wasn't for Kevin Harvick, you wouldn't have known that anybody else driving a Stewart-Haas Ford was competing at NASCAR's highest level.
You're telling me. That's going to be interesting to see. I think that Josh Berry definitely has his hands full. I thought it was quite clear earlier in the year that Josh Berry was probably the most talent in the Xfinity series and was kind of ready for that next step. But as the season progressed, man, had some mistakes in the Xfinity series. His very seldom chances that he had in the Cup Series outside of Richmond, which was kind of a fluky track position thing, he wasn't very competitive. And he was driving race cars that were pretty competitive. So it's going to be an interesting year for Stewart-Haas. I think that, they'll probably manage their expectations, or at least would hope that they manage their expectations and pick their spots. I do think that Gragson has tremendous amount of upside. I mean, if you give that guy a race winning car, he's going to be competitive, or he's at least going to put it, he's going to get the most out of it. And if you find yourself with Noah Gragson, to your inside or your outside on a late race restart, he's as aggressive as anybody, and he's not going to back down. But, we haven't seen much out of speed-wise, practice, qualifying, anything out of SHR in the past year. If it weren't, like you said, if it weren't for Kevin Harvick, it would have been hard to even notice that they were on the track.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin Harvick took cars that we didn't think were going to be capable when you watch him in practice of doing anything but finishing inside the top 20, found a way to keep it out of trouble and got the most out of machines that didn't have capabilities to win a race. So SHR, a team that we're going to want to watch, and very curious to see if they've made proper adjustments. You talked a little bit about the new nose for Ford, and maybe SHR needed that to try and get them over the hump the same way with Toyota. But Toyota put on a much better early season display at the Clash, a race, of course, that's not always indicative of high speed 1.5 mile and aero sensitive tracks that are out there. You can follow Chris on Twitter at Chris Werme 15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. And you can, of course, follow our guest from earlier in the show, Danielle Trotta at Danielle Trotta. For all things Bet the Board, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Worm, I know a lot of our loyal Bet the Board listeners, whether they had a profitable Super Bowl or they found themselves giving away some of the profits that they've earned all season, are hoping that we can come with some actionable information for Daytona. But this will be one of the shortest parts of our program. It's a race that you and I have been open and honest about. We don't bet a ton. There are NASCAR bettors out there who like to take small percentages. They play their models, and a hat tip to them. They feel they can glean an edge. It's never something that we've been that profitable with in the past. You, of course, you look at the odds board, and everybody's tightly bunched up. I mean, Ryan Blaney, Denny Hamlin, Brad Keselowski, Chase Elliott, Chris Buescher, Joey Logano, Kyle Larson, William Byron, Kyle Busch, Christopher Bell, Martin Truex Jr., Bubba Wallace, Tyler Reddick. All of those guys at prices of 20-1 or shorter at the majority of books. Things start to get a little bit interesting. But can you share for our listeners that may be new to NASCAR some of the reasons why you don't love to bet Daytona the same way that you'll look to approach Las Vegas, a 1.5 mile super speedway in early March?
Yeah, I think that you could just look at the odds, and odds makers can tell you that they aren't as sure as who's going to win this race. When you see the favorite at 12-1, you very rarely will see that at a place, a 1.5 mile track or a place like Las Vegas. When you're coming to pack racing, there's a lot of luck involved. You have to have someone that's willing to push you and not kind of leave you hanging out to dry. You have to avoid the big one. There's always going to be a big wreck at Daytona that takes out, a handful of race cars. Whenever that happens, especially late race variants where you get a green, white checkered, a lot of weird things can happen. We've seen it where, $1 million parlay is cashed and a top 10 bets where guys.
Yeah, those top 10 prices don't exist anymore. So hat tip to those folks who were able to cash those tickets. You've seen odds makers considerably shorten some of the derivative markets as a result.
Well, I mean, high risk, high reward. If you're going to be betting a track like this, I do like higher odds guys. I think that that's important to understand. I don't think taking a favorite, although they could win, is going to be profitable in the long run. If you look at the last 3 winners, was it Denny Hamlin, Michael McDowell, and Ricky Stenhouse? 2 of those guys went off at over 20-1. So it's just very difficult to handicap. And when you're trying to do this and your goal is to make money and find value, it's really easy to sit this one out. And I get so many messages after these super speedway races. It's like, I just can't sit out. How do you sit out? I lost all this money. Well, then don't watch it. That's what I have to do, because if I watch and I see some live lines.
Wait, so you're not, hold on a second. I know you don't watch super speedway race throughout the year. So you're not going to watch the Daytona 500 at all.
I will probably watch. I'm so into NASCAR that I'll probably watch it, but maybe I'll delay it. So that way.
Okay. So you're not tempted to try and bet anything live,
because I could be at a bar watching this with no audio and look at some odds and go, oh, well, I mean, 30-1, the guy's running 5th, he's had a good speed week. So I just wouldn't be able to contain myself. So I try to just stay as far away from it as possible. And what I don't get too caught up is the stuff leading up to the race, because you're going to develop an opinion. If you're watching the duels and you watch qualifying, you're going to start to hear interviews, guys that feel comfortable. I don't care how good your car is. If you get caught up in the big one, you're not going to cash any tickets. So I just kind of separate myself for a few days from NASCAR, and I am entertained. I do get excited to watch the end of the race or the end of the 500 to see who wins, but ultimately it has no real bearing on this season, other than it punches a ticket. And it punches a ticket for a fringe guy. There's a driver out there that are, the 16th or 17th ranked driver. I mean, think about if Daniel Suarez goes out there and wins the 500, that makes his season. Someone that's
suddenly the sponsorship dollars start flowing in, and it changes the dynamic and a trajectory for a driver that may or may not have been on the hot seat coming in, that suddenly has a much rosier outlook on his job security, so to speak. And Ricky Stenhouse parlayed into a multi-year deal. The JTG Doherty was able to try and run up, some of the revenue that they generated. And while the 47 was better, I think, in some races than we expected, never was a legitimate threat to win it
No.
all. But you win the Daytona 500 and suddenly you are mentioned in the same breath as some of the best drivers ever in the sport. The good thing for you, when we go to a super speedway the following week at Atlanta, we're going to have no show. So you're not going to have to deep dive any of those numbers. We're going to give you a week off for good behavior. It's a bye week for all the Bet the Board production team that has had a grind basically beginning last summer with Stay Green, all the football shows and everything else we do. We know you're just rolling out of bed trying to record a show or two with NASCAR getting going, but we'll get you back into the saddle full time in early March with Vegas, where we have some actionable elements. So I guess, at this point, rather than spending a ton of time on a race we're not going to bet, you've looked at all the season long odds. We've shared our perspective in terms of some of the long shots and tying up our money on those 10-1s, 15-1s, what have you. From a best bet standpoint, do you see any win totals that are worth a small investment for our listeners that may want to get themselves involved over the course of the next 9-month grind and living and dying with some of your favorite drivers?
I think Chase Elliott over 1.5 wins. I just don't see another season like we saw last year. Obviously no wins, but sat out 7 races. I don't think he's going to make that same mistake again. I anticipate him racing all 36 weeks. That's going to obviously increase his chances. And the amount of speed that's been in the 5 and the 24, I can't imagine the 9 just sitting there as the clear third best driver in that organization. I anticipate him to show some speed early in the season. He's also a guy that is great at road courses. And there were times, maybe last year, where it looked like he had a chance to win. Some silly mistakes kind of kept him out of it. But he can also win on super speedways. So whenever there's a driver that can win anywhere, and you see a win total at 1.5, and then you see his teammates at that 2.5 point or 3.5, I think it's important to kind of jump on that now. And then you get to be a fan with Chase Elliott, because Chase Elliott fans are just kind of a pain in the ass. But if you have a season-long
you put
total,
yourself in the NASCAR. You put yourself in the NASCAR clique, rooting for the sport's most popular driver. Hey, one thing I will say on the season-long bets, I mean, when you're looking to do this for folks that have a bankroll dedicated to NASCAR, smaller positions here. I mean, you're much better off to try and earn some of the win equity for the best bets where you're tying up your money for 3 hours, and we share those matchups on Sunday. So this is somewhere where we feel an edge. Chris and I have an investment here in the season long as well, but don't want you going and plunking down, a massive amount of your bankroll that you're going to live and die with every single race here. It's a small edge, but unfortunately in NASCAR, win totals, they hold on to your money a little bit longer than they do in college football or the NFL. So for those folks who don't have perfect accounting, maybe you suddenly find a windfall in your account in the middle of November and can't remember that you placed the bet back in early February. One thing I'll say on that market, though, that I would like to see, and, I'm sure there are plenty of odds makers who can't stand what we do, and we constantly bitch and moan about NASCAR markets and the head-to-head matchups we never got for the Clash, and probably wouldn't have gotten reposted anyways when you move the event from a Sunday to a Saturday. I'd love to see over-under for not even regular season, for team wins. And I shouldn't say regular season, so do make sure you read the stipulation. This should be over-under for races for all 36 and include the postseason, but team wins. So if there's any odds maker out there that wants to try and innovate their markets and you're going to update all those, give us an over under for Joe Gibbs team wins. Give us an over under for Trackhouse. Give us an over under for Hendrick. And you can allow people to kind of root for manufacturers. I think it'd be fun to see an over under for how many race wins Chevy's able to get, Ford and Toyota for the season. And of course, selfishly, we just want a little bit more of an edge that won't cater to recreational bettors. So we have to try and do that. But all right, my friend, you get a couple weeks off for good behavior. We'll be back before Vegas. We'll have plenty of stuff there. We can only hope that we get a couple of good prices on drivers that we have already identified as we sit there and wait with bated breath. But anything else that you would like to get off your chest and share with our loyal listeners for the NASCAR season preview show? And of course, Daytona, that's right around the corner this weekend.
I just think at Daytona, you're just looking to see if some guys can pick up some momentum from last year. I think if Chase Elliott goes out there and has a good run, that could be really important to his season. But ultimately, we're not going to know until Las Vegas, in my opinion, who's going to be the teams that just show speed week in and week out on ovals. So last year, if you look at Las Vegas, it was Larson and Byron. And then that same thing at Phoenix. So I think when we head into Phoenix, or we're leaving Phoenix heading into Bristol, I think that'll be when we have a clearer understanding of who the players can be week in and week out not necessarily just these super speedway races.
Enjoy Daytona, all you loyal listeners of the Stay Green podcast, guys and girls. And for any folks who are going, wait a second, we have a podcast on our feed and the Super Bowl's already been completed. Stick around. You'll have a lot of fun with Chris and myself as we deep dive NASCAR. Of course, Payne will get out of retirement, or at least I should say a little bit of a sabbatical during February for the March Madness shows. But enjoy Daytona. No show Atlanta week. We will be back late February, early March for the Vegas race. And that's one that Chris and I really look forward to for a mile and a half. We'll pour one out for Auto Club Speedway that would otherwise be on the calendar as well. But best of luck with whatever investments you choose to make, whether they be season long or of the super speedway variety for the Super Bowl of the NASCAR season at Daytona. And of course, everything at Atlanta. Follow Chris on Twitter at Chris Werme 15. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me there. And most importantly, we'll see you at the window.